ESPN's David Hale put out an all-decade team. So college football from 2014 to 2023, the four-team playoff era all-team, right? Like an all-America team for that decade. And there were some Georgia Bulldogs on the list. He did a first team, a second team, a third team, and honorable mentions for each position. And I think that there are some Georgia snubs. You can make some arguments that some Georgia guys weren't on this list that should have been at least an honorable mention. Some of the placements I think were great. And look, a lot of Georgia players made this list, and he has these. He kind of had a prerequisite criteria for picking these guys. I'm going to read it real quick. Ryan Curley from Dawg was here talking about the all-decade team and all the dogs on it. I'm going to run through the list of the positions that he had Georgia players on it and not. They had one for almost all the position groups. Our newsletter is down below in the description. Make sure you're checking that out. Spring football right around the corner. Just a few days from now, you're going to want to keep up. You're going to want to be keeping up with all the Dawg Post content. Here's what he said was the criteria. Our goal is to not just identify the players who won the most or posted the best stats or had the most highlights. Even that would have been difficult, but rather this list is meant to include all those metrics and also something more ephemeral to reward the players whose performances were so essential to the fabric of college football over the past 10 years that the story of the four-team playoff era couldn't be told without them. Quarterback, Stetson Bennett made it as an honorable mention. You know his story. It's one of the best stories in college football. I think it would have been egregious not to mention him in this, but he doesn't make first team, second, or third. He's an honorable mention along with guys like Lamar Jackson, Tua, Jalen Hurts, Mac Jones, all those Bama quarterbacks, Michael Penix Jr., Caleb Williams, Bryce Young, Mariota, Jameis Winston. He's in a bunch with those guys. All of those guys are like the legendary quarterbacks of the last 10 years. First team was Joe Burrow. Second team was Deshaun Watson. Third team was Baker Mayfield. Heisman, national champions, all of those guys. Obviously, a lot of those players were better than Stetson Bennett. I'm glad that Stetson made it as an honorable mention. His teams were stacked. But Stetson, it would have been egregious not to mention him on this list, especially him being a Heisman finalist, winning 2 national championships. His resume is very unique, like a lot of the players on this list. Running back, this one is where you start to get to some debates with Georgia. First team and second team and third team, no Georgia guys. Honorable mention, I only see Nick Chubb. And you can make the argument that Nick Chubb deserved to be more than an honorable mention. We'll just ignore that and be content that he did make that list. Sony Michel, though, I think also should have been mentioned along those guys. There's people like Deuce Vaughn, Zeke Elliott, Devin Singletary, Rashad Penny, Leonard Fournette. Some of those guys are the honorable mentions. If you look at the numbers, you look at the impact, you look at what the team's accomplished, Sony Michel deserves to be on that list with them. I think the tandem of him and Nick Chubb is something that doesn't happen a lot in college football. And I think that Sony is the first snub on this list at the running back position for this all playoff era, this all 14 playoff decade team. First team, just real quick, just to go through it, they had Derrick Henry and Jonathan Taylor. Derrick Henry, obviously a Heisman winner. Jonathan Taylor, obviously, has a lot of rushing records. That's fine. Saquon Barkley was electric. Christian McCaffrey as your second team. Third team, Dalvin Cook and Travis Etienne. They're great. I think Nick Chubb is on that third team, second team level as far as impact. You could have put him there, but definitely Sony Michel has got to be an honorable mention. Wide receiver. This is one I'm just going to glaze over it. Georgia hasn't had a super impactful wide receiver in this past decade. Some really talented ones. Guys like Malcolm Mitchell kind of finished it out there at the end of the decade, but Mecole Hardman, obviously a guy that made some electric plays. George Pickens, obviously a really good receiver for Georgia, but they didn't have a real standout guy that belonged on a list with people like Jamar Chase and CeeDee Lamb and Rome Odunze and people like that. Marvin Harrison Jr., right? So no Georgia players there. Tight end, though. And here's your first team on the list. It's Brock Bowers. It's not close. I'll actually read a little bit of what they said because it's true. The easiest pick on this list, that'd be Brock Bowers. Sure, there have been some other exceptional tight ends in the past decade as the position has flourished in the post-Gronk era of big-time football, but no one did it like Bowers, who was a superstar from day one in Athens. Very true. We haven't seen a lot of college football tight ends like Brock Bowers. Kyle Pitts was the second team. Michael Mayer was the third team. I think they got that right. I think those were probably the best tight ends of the last decade. And Brock Bowers going off to the NFL, we'll see if he can continue that. Kyle Pitts hasn't been as successful as people thought he would, kind of suffering in that Falcons offense. We'll see if something happens like that to Bowers. You wouldn't think so. Center, this one was a little weird, and I'm going to talk about the center and the O-line at the same time. They did center and then other O-linemen, so like guards, tackles, etc. But Cedric Van Pran was mentioned, but as an honorable mention with the other O-linemen. And I think that he's a snub to at least be an honorable mention with the center. Obviously, he kind of rounded out the last few years of this decade, but the 44 consecutive starts, not being injured, the leadership, being the starting center on 2 national championship teams, you have to at least give him an honorable mention, along with guys like Landon Dickerson, Ryan Kelly from Alabama, Tyler Linderbaum, right? Some of those guys may be better than Cedric Van Pran, but accomplishment-wise, he deserved to be at least an honorable mention. On the other O-lineman, the only other Georgia guy that was mentioned, and it was a third-teamer, Andrew Thomas. This guy's a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. He had to be, obviously, great career at Georgia. He had to be high on that list. Defensive ends, none. And it's because of stats, right? Obviously, there have been some really good defensive ends. I kind of consider Trayvon Walker to be a defensive end. He was the number one guy you pointed to. Well, maybe he should have been an honorable mention, a guy that won a national championship, ends up being a first-round pick. He didn't have the stats, though, like guys like Chase Young and Myles Garrett did, and Aiden Hutchinson and Joey Bosa, Cleveland Farrell, Kayvon Thibodeau, right? Georgia didn't have a guy quite like that made a statistical impact the way those did. So I get not having a defensive end. Defensive tackle, Georgia gets a couple guys, and rightfully so, right? Look at them in the last few years. Jordan Davis gets second team. Jalen Carter gets third. I do think Jalen Carter probably is your first team guy, right? Their first team guy was Christian Wilkins and Ed Oliver. Very, very good. Another guy that, let me see and make sure he's on here. Quinnen Williams, the second team with Jordan Davis. Jonathan Allen, third team with Jalen Carter. Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis both deserved it. If you're saying there's a snub, I thought maybe you could say that Devontae Wyatt was an honorable mention snub, but Georgia, well represented on that list. Linebackers, they got 2 on there, and this is the really interesting one. This one shows the dominance Georgia's had. They put Nakobe Dean as a first-teamer and Roquan Smith as a second. They put 3 linebackers for first team. Will Anderson Jr., Micah Parsons, and Nakobe Dean. Obviously, Micah Parsons and Will Anderson, more of edge rushers. Nakobe in the middle. All high-level linebackers in college football. And Roquan Smith, I believe, was better than Nakobe Dean. They didn't win the national championship. Nakobe does have that ring, and I think that's what elevated him. And he was the best defensive player as far as impact on a defense that was stacked with NFL talent, Nakobe Dean. So that's what I think is winning him this over Roquan Smith. But Roquan, mentioned with TJ Watt and Reuben Foster for that second team, shows you the dominance for Georgia there. Safeties. Lewis Cine was an honorable mention. He's the only one that gets mentioned. I think Georgia's had a lot of really good safeties. The other one I thought might be a snub, maybe Christopher Smith. You look at the statistics of guys like Budda Baker that are even like second-teamers on this list. And Christopher Smith's are really similar, and he was a starting safety on back-to-back national champions. I think your snub there is Chris Smith. Lewis Cine, obviously very productive at Georgia. He was a tackle leader. He gets an honorable mention. I think those guys are right there. Corner, none. Was Georgia snubbed? Could it be Darion Kendrick? Not really 1 year. Keely Ringo was more a big moments guy than an overall impact player. I thought maybe you could say DeAndre Baker should have been an honorable mention. He ends up being a first-round pick. He wins a national award for Georgia. I think that could have been there. Something they definitely got wrong, I think, was kicker. They had Rodrigo Blankenship as a second-teamer. That's fine, but you got to have Jack Podlesny on this list, too, kicking in 2 national championship games. Right there, up there with Rodrigo for Georgia's all-time kicking records. I think they get that wrong by not mentioning him with guys like Matt Gay, Zane Gonzalez, Harrison Mevis, the thicker kicker from Missouri. Very good kicker, obviously. So Georgia, well represented on this list. Think that there were a few snubs that you could argue, but for the most part, pretty good job. You got to have stats. What tells the story and the impact of the last 10 years? Stetson Bennett's the first player that comes to mind. Brock Bowers, Nakobe Dean, Roquan Smith, Jalen Carter, right? Nick Chubb. They get all the obvious ones right. I think there were a few snubs. But overall, ESPN does a pretty good job with this decade team list, and I focused on the Georgia Bulldogs here. Thank you for watching.